Chapter 3. Doughnut Economy and Entrepreneurship. 3.1 Who are we? Homo economicus. Prioritizing financial interests and economic growth over human life is nothing new, and it has been obvious for a long time, especially through the state of environmental pollution, its associated mortality for many species and other related harmful phenomena. Homo economicus or Chicago man has become a hardly questionable paradigm by the majority of society. The link between economic growth and ecological collapse is now well demonstrated and, unfortunately, hopes for green growth, or the aforementioned sustainable development, have little basis today. Perhaps a relative decoupling of GDP from emissions could be achieved by replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. But this cannot be done fast enough to respect temperature rise limits between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, if the economy continues to grow at its usual rhythm. This is due to the simple reason that more growth would mean even more energy demand, which makes it even harder to achieve with renewables. In the short time we have left, Hickel and Callies, 2020, Schroeder and Storm, 2020. And even if we get there, renewable energies and the production of their infrastructure will mean even more extractivism of some finite resources. That will not be able to sustain today's energy-intensive consumption model, especially if it does not seem to stop growing, but quite the opposite. This phenomenon is also often depicted as Jevons paradox, also known as the rebound effect, which is explained in the Guide to Energy Descent as follows. In early 19th century England, the economist William Stanley Jevons found that as the efficiency of steam engines improved, the country, as a whole, consumed more and more coal, not the other way around, as might be expected. This happens because consuming available energy always brings economic benefit, production of more goods or services, and so more efficient machines end up being used more than their predecessors. In everyday life, we can also see this, for example, in the fact that the less petrol a car consumes, the more kilometers we tend to drive in it, or the less electricity an appliance consumes, the longer it is in use. 3.2 Where are we going? And how is the doughnut economy linked to these phenomena? As Association Vespera de Nada says, anyone can understand that, however big the world we live in is, it is a finite world and that there are physical limits that we cannot cross. It is more difficult to dismantle techno-utopian myths, to unravel the limits that renewable energies also have, or the impossibility of recycling 100% with the costs that recycling also has. It is even more difficult to assume that we are not gods and that we have to humbly assume that we must live by the rules. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established in 1988, and was awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for its work on climate change, and assessing the impact of human activity on climate, UNESCO, 2018. Since then, it has provided reports on the state of scientific, technical and socio-economic knowledge on climate change and response strategies. Its 2018 report already indicated that the only feasible way to stay within safe biophysical limits is for developed nations to actively slow the pace of production and consumption. This approach is also more ecologically consistent. Reducing production also removes pressure on other planetary boundaries. In 2022, its sixth and most recent report was released. The same solution was endorsed by Professor Emeritus Bono of the University of Valencia, citing that it involves slowing down and finally stopping the exponential growth of population and fixed capital, which implies an institutional and philosophical change and social innovation. It requires defining desirable and sustainable levels of population and industrial output. Unfortunately, the two dominant thoughts of the 20th century, both the former Soviet Union and the Western Bloc, were slaves to the economic idea of perpetual growth. Both ignored their costs, mainly the environmental ones. The USSR's system fell first because of its centralizing approach, while the West's decentralized market, which in comparison has greater respect for individual freedoms, is holding up a little longer. However, it too will collapse. Actually, the primacy of economic growth is not even questioned in discourses on sustainable development. Even the famous Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations in 2015, as a supposedly more ambitious global agenda of the international community, are being criticized in this regard. For example, the neo-colonialist and ethnocentric vision of placing several of the postulates under the leadership of developed countries, as if they were a model for poor countries to follow and imitate, is something that is reflected in some sensitive goals, such as the 12.1, which speaks of applying models of production and consumption under the leadership of developed countries, when a large part of our production and consumption patterns are a model of unsustainability. Furthermore, Goal 8 directly encompasses promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, following a strategy of 3% annual global GDP growth, whereas economic growth is not an end in itself and continued economic growth is simply physically impossible on a finite planet. Unfortunately, human beings tend to believe in the eventuality of a catastrophe when it has already occurred, that is, too late. This is demonstrated most illustratively below, by the famous paradox of Jacquot's water lily, explained by Carlos Taibois. By comparison, if GDP per capita continues to grow by 3.5% per year, average growth in France from 1949 to 1959, it will have grown by a multiple of 31 in 1 century and by 961 in 2. If growth automatically generated well-being, we would now be living in paradise. However, we are on the road to hell, and almost literally. According to the report of the previously mentioned Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the planet will face a global average temperature increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which will cause severe environmental, economic, political, and social disruptions worldwide. The Copernicus Climate Change Service also defined 2020 as the warmest year in Europe, with 0.4 degrees Celsius above the previous record values. The idea of sustainable development must be approached in its non-growth aspect, that is, seen as a qualitative improvement in the ability to meet needs without a quantitative increase in output beyond the environmental carrying capacity. Although neoclassical economists might define economic growth as the increase in the production of goods and services typically measured by their market value, an economy can develop without growing. In 2020, another scientific study by 20 specialists in conservation ecology and ecological economics highlighted the contradiction between economic growth and biodiversity conservation. The article urges the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to base its reports on a scenario that goes beyond the idea of economic growth. The proposals also include adopting limits to global trade and resource extraction or reducing and sharing labor, some of the alternatives we will discuss later. The Doughnut economy proposal may seem abstract, but a number of initiatives are already starting to incorporate this alternative, for example, repair cafes, community gardens, agricultural farms, cooperatives, etc. What assumptions and preconceptions, in our minds and frameworks and institutions, in our economic reality do we need to give up, transform or create in order to change the course from growth to the Doughnut economy? One possible step would be to describe and discuss existing mainstream alternatives that promise to become the building blocks of a new economy, more suited to a Doughnut model. Despite the unknowns, advocates of the Doughnut economy converge on the need for individual and collective political action to voluntarily and permanently reduce economies. Moreover, the year 2020, with its related COVID-19 crisis, the growing climate emergency and social injustices, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, have left societies at a crossroads, and economists are increasingly called upon for answers. However, despite the above-mentioned timid academic advances, are economic studies fulfilling its role with respect to the growing demand for emergency and the rapidly changing world? Rethinking Economics report, Economists and Crises, 2020 is based on a survey of 920 economics students and graduates about their level of preparedness for the environmental and systemic crisis. Their findings? 78.5% of respondents think that the 2020 crisis should be a turning point in the way economics education is approached. 42.3% of respondents say that their economics studies do not teach them how economics is connected and how dependent it is on the environment. Only 8.5% of respondents believe that economic proposals are free of political bias, despite the fact that the aberrant majority of mainstream economics textbooks do not openly mention their preferences. How do the authors of the study define the mainstream economy? They refer to the neoclassical version that dominates textbooks and classrooms around the world, which defines the subject as a particular methodology, rather than seeing it as an open field of study. The authors of the study also recognize that a number of economics teaching institutions embrace critical, heterodox, and pluralistic views. However, they note that from the experience of their 120 member groups on 6 continents, the significant number of economic studies are based on a neoclassical framework, with little or no requirement for critical engagement with other schools of thought and other disciplines. And how does the neoclassical view of the environment position itself? This approach stems from Cartesian dualism, that is, the differentiation between nature and culture. Its view of nature as something external to humans has facilitated the almost total appropriation of the natural world and its resources, in favor of unlimited economic growth. The Doughnut economy and the new model of work. The Doughnut economy proposes an economy based on natural and human well-being and not on the mere accumulation of capital, a planned change that is designed in advance, because without planning, we will be forced to live this change, through natural catastrophes or other crises. Furthermore, in terms of employment and capitalistic welfare, it seeks to reduce selectively. The Doughnut economy would limit ecologically destructive and socially unnecessary production sectors, weapons, advertising, planned obsolescence, meat production, etc., while supporting the most socially important sectors, such as health, environmental care, education, care and conviviality. Recessions, on the other hand, do not discriminate so generously. Moreover, as we will see later in this chapter, in addition to supporting necessary jobs, it would introduce policies not only to prevent unemployment, but even to improve it, by shortening the working day or introducing a universal basic income, Hickel, 2020. On the other hand, escaping from the androcentric system and turning towards a bioethical one will require answers to the questions: what needs will have to be prioritized and satisfied in the framework of ecological transition? And what will be the necessary jobs? The next are three of the ideas that could be applied within the framework of entrepreneurship, in line to the Doughnut economy. Green jobs. Work less, work all. Care jobs. Green jobs. According to the International Labour Organization, green jobs are decent jobs that contribute to preserving and restoring the environment, by incorporating one or more of the following: increasing the efficiency of energy and raw material consumption, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, minimizing waste and pollution, protecting and restoring ecosystems, and contributing to climate change adaptation. In the same line, the European Parliament, 2015 takes up the definition of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and defines green jobs as any decent job that contributes to preserving and restoring the quality of the environment, whether in agriculture, industry, services, or administration. Few people would question the growth of these jobs in the sector of biodiversity protection or proper waste management. Other elements of the transition strategy towards green jobs proposed by the researchers include those that would be related to improving the energy efficiency of production processes, industry, construction, and the use of household appliances. Electrify heating and most transport using renewable electricity and hydrogen. Helping workers disadvantaged by the transition, through training, education, sector relocation, or retirement. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has, to some extent, facilitated the shift to lower emission employment, as many people have had to become accustomed to working from home or walking and cycling for commuting. In the energy sector, for example, green jobs would go hand in hand with the replacement of fossil fuels with renewable energies. But even these activities do not solve the problem of energy and resources consumption and emissions creation. There should also be a serious debate about the needs and types of jobs that are really needed. The new crisis will bring with it a return to more humane work and, in many cases, useless jobs will have to disappear. As Trainer says, or hopes, the following will be eliminated: production for advertising, much of transport, packaging, construction, many cosmetics or fashion items, poor quality and short-lived products, motorways, weapons, etc. At the same time, others will take their place: demolishers of buildings, roads and cement, repairers of a myriad of machines and devices, permaculture experts, composting technicians, etc. Parikh says, could anything be more demoralizing than having to wake up in the morning, 5 out of 7 days of one's adult life, to perform a task that one secretly believes is unnecessary, a waste of time and resources, or even a way of making the world worse? Parikh, with this sentence, recalls that Greber, 2018, begins his book about forms of paid employment that are so completely useless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify their existence, even though, as part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. 2019, 599. Work less, so that all can work. Jorge Reachman quotes the following parable by Heinrich Boll. A tourist notices the charming scene of a humbly dressed fisherman lounging against a rowboat stranded on the sand, on a splendid beach. He photographs him, offers him a cigarette, and they strike up a conversation. "What are you doing sleeping instead of going out to sea and fishing?" "I caught enough fish this morning." "But imagine," replies the tourist, "going out to sea 3 or 4 times a day, and catching 3 or 4 times as many fish. After a year, you could buy a motorboat, after 2 years another one, after 3 years it could be 1 or 2 good-sized fishing boats. Imagine that. Some time later you could build a freezing factory or a salting plant. Later you would even fly your own helicopter to locate the fishing targets and guide your boats to them. Or maybe you would own your own fleet of trucks to bring the fish to the capital, and then. And so?" asked the fisherman. "Then," says the tourist in a tone of triumph, "you could sit quietly on the beach, take a snooze in the sun, and contemplate the beauty of the ocean." The fisherman looks at him. "That is exactly what I was doing, before you showed up here." In Europe, working hours have decreased by an annual average of 3,200 at the end of the 19th century, and around 1,700 at the beginning of the 20th century, remaining fairly stable since then. Something that ecologistas en action in their latest campaign, Work Less to Work All and Decrease Better, 2021 define as obsolete, since for the last 100 years, we have been working 8 hours a day, or even more, in case of many precarious jobs. The data tells us that a 25% reduction in working time would reduce our ecological footprint by 30%, our carbon footprint by 36.6%, and a 10.5% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. We also know that while productivity has increased, wages have stagnated since the 1980s. Moreover, where working hours are shorter, life satisfaction levels are higher. There is scope to cut back without losing out. Even more so since work is a socially constructed institution and, therefore, the form it takes is never natural, but always cultural. According to Parikh, shorter working hours are desirable for 3 main reasons. 1. The first reason has to do with equity, sharing, and the concept of shared work. If employment is becoming a scarce commodity, hours worked could be reduced to allow access to the unemployed. As the philosopher and thinker Bertrand Russell warned already almost 100 years ago, we are facing overwork for some and starvation for others, 1935, a rule that seems to still apply, as, unfortunately, many others accurate sociological observations highlighted by this author. On the other hand, this type of measure is nothing new. FD. Roosevelt introduced it in the United States after the Great Depression, and several European countries, Germany, Austria, Sweden, and Slovenia used similar partial measures in response to the 2008 crisis. However, here it must always be taken into account that the new part-time jobs must be dignified, and not become a form of pauperization or injustice towards employees. 2. The second reason is ecological. Less work means less production, less travel, less extraction, and less pollution. Scientists at Boston College also analyzed the relationship between CO2 emissions and weekly working hours in the US. They found out that every 1% increase in working hours leads to a 0.65% increase in emissions, and concluded that reducing working time could be a critical component in mitigating environmental impacts. NRGA with Ringabovardi also argues that spending less time at work also promotes habits such as slow food or slow transport, whose environmental footprint is much smaller. 3. Finally, less work equates to more time for education, caring activities, and democratic participation and, thus, the overall improvement of society's well-being and health. This is supported by Callies, who says that a shorter working week could not only combat unemployment but also create more time for leisure and coexistence. However, it should be remembered, at this point, that the ecological footprint of infinite and consumerist leisure is also important, and that strategies to reduce working time lose their effectiveness if free time is spent flying to the Bahamas or buying luxury goods. This phenomenon is often called the Fordist trap of the work and spend culture, and is constitutive of a society with only 2 roles, producer and consumer. This could be alleviated by various policies, such as the universal basic income. How could such a transformation take place? Researchers propose several ways, including early or temporary retirement or job sharing, that is, the redistribution of working time. These policies are not intended to increase the total volume of jobs, but rather that work ends up being shared by more people. In fact, Trainer, taking the example of the Israeli kibbutz settlements, even proposes work coordination committees in the communities themselves that would ensure that everyone who wants to work would have a share of the existing work, and maintains that they would need to do much less than in today's consumer society, where we probably work 3 times as much. Care. Last but not least, care is the notion around which labor transition should be organized, according to many researchers, Dengler and Strunk, 2018. Ecologistas en Action said in 2017, the mercantile world only considers that which has monetary expression. The fetish instrument that synthesizes this conception is the gross domestic product, GDP, an index that synthesizes the evolution of economic magnitudes. On the other hand, essential issues for sustaining the life and well-being of people are excluded, such as the care tasks that are mostly carried out by women, mutual aid or volunteering, nor the environmental costs that the development model entails are taken into account. Thus, in today's economy, care work remains undervalued, increasing gender inequalities. Therefore, it is required the equitable distribution of care work which, in the same way as jobs related to environmental protection, has the potential to offset the current rise in unemployment, while fostering a more dignified, healthy, and sustainable society. Some researchers go so far as to call this aspect the care revolution, for its role in creating a much more caring society. How? Through more leisure time, more supportive social infrastructure, and more security as prerequisites for an improvement of the position of care workers, and the recognition of their work. Ultimately, it becomes especially interesting to combine the following 2 objectives, at the same time: more care and ecological resources and less use of resources in sectors such as arms manufacturing, power and coal plants, and the individual transport network. In general, it is a question of restructuring and re-educating society to meet real needs and preserve ecological foundations at the same time. Another movement that strongly joins this cause and provides a rallying point is the feminist economics section, or even the ecofeminism, who demand for better treatment of care work. This movement is defined, in the words of Ecologistas en Action, 2018, as a current of thought and activism that critically analyzes the beliefs that underpin the ecocidal, patriarchal, capitalist and colonial model of life, that denounces the risks to which it subjects people and the rest of the living world and proposes alternative views, in order to reverse this war against life. Ecofeminist economics, therefore, provides an analysis of the current destructive relationship between humanity and non-human nature, through an understanding of women's position at the boundaries of economic systems. From this perspective, women's labor and life, like that of the natural world, are externalized and exploited by the traditional economy. This movement argues, not without reason, that the colossus that is today's capitalist corporations would not function if it were not for the submerged iceberg of free care work performed, over decades, mostly by women. Interestingly, they are made invisible, unrecognized, and unvalued by the market, though it is precisely care work that is often compatible with environmental and social sustainability. In relation to care work, as EACEA reminds us, feminists have, for years, been denouncing the undervaluing of care work and, in turn, of the women who tend to do most of it, despite the fact that care is fundamental to the mental, physical, and relational integrity of society. Care can become the hallmark of an economy based on reproduction, rather than expansion. Reproduction refers to activities that sustain the life cycle, typically within the family. But more generally, it encompasses all processes of sustenance and restoration. In today's economy, care work is still gendered, undervalued, and pushed into the shadow of the formal economy. A solidarity economy is labor-intensive, precisely because human labor is what gives value to care. As such, it has the potential to offset the current rise in unemployment, while fostering a more humane society. 3. For the role of the social economy. One of the most important functions of the social economy is to increase employment and, above all, the social and occupational integration of the most excluded groups. Classic labor market instruments, career counseling, intermediation, training often produce poor results, especially when the measure of their effectiveness is the achievement of permanent and quality jobs. In such cases, it is necessary to build complete support sequences, including the acquisition of work experience, very often in conditions adapted to the skills and needs of the individual concerned, that is, to the experience that enables the beneficiaries to acquire the habit of working. From this point of view, social economy entities that create employment for groups at risk of social exclusion perform a large number of functions, including being providers of services, like training, counseling, mediation, etc., creation of jobs specifically dedicated to excluded groups, incubation of employment projects, acting as defenders of the people, representing the interests of the most vulnerable and socially excluded people, etc. Moreover, social economy entities active in the labor field have a huge innovation capital, as they carry out activities for very specific groups, often being pioneers at national level, being forced to build their own working methodology, becoming a great reservoir of knowledge and social capital, as they operate in local communities, and their action is very often very comprehensive and goes beyond market activities. Thanks to these characteristics, they often create innovative projects that are, at the same time, well integrated in the specificity of a given environment, so that their achievements must be taken into account when formulating active labor market policies. Furthermore, these social and local features, and the personalization of actions according to the needs, put social economy organizations in a privileged position when it comes to including them in the labor market perspective. As Callies highlights, social economy entities can be very important in the eco-social transition, as they focus on care work, have a high percentage of volunteer activity, do not tend to expand at all costs, and are less resource-intensive than their counterparts in the private sector economy. Such practices allow them to better cultivate solidarity and interpersonal relationships, by generating non-monetary wealth as a great added value. This, together with the policies mentioned above, such as a basic income, employment guarantee, a shorter working week or job sharing without a reduction in monthly wages, could combat unemployment and, at the same time, create more coexistence. Adopting such proposals would reduce economic insecurity, avoiding any dependence on the hegemony of higher economic growth, and provide employment in activities that support the common good. In the same way, the activity of third sector organizations tends to have lower economic costs, as they do not employ exorbitant salaries or contemplate armored contracts among managers. On the contrary, there is a base of altruistic and voluntary collaboration. The 2010 Third Sector Yearbook of Social Action in Spain showed that volunteer staff represent 62.3% of the total working in all organizations, and, as there is no profit motive, the costs do not include the profit margin, and if there are any, they are reinvested in the organizations themselves. This premise would be the basis for a new economy, an economy where stable productive capacity, without growth, serves to cover the needs of people, even the most vulnerable, with a minimum consumption of resources, labor, and waste, and in an ecologically responsible manner. It would also take into account the equitable distribution of work, including care work, within the framework of a cooperative and non-profit economy. Unfortunately, our current economy operates according to completely opposite principles. The maximization of profits for those with the largest share of capital seeks to steadily increase consumption and GDP. As Teresa Crespo highlights, the work of people at risk of exclusion that is provided by the social economy does not always achieve the level of productivity that would be necessary to obtain competitive and sustainable production, and consequently these entities assume, in one way or another, the deficit that may occur, understanding that their activity generates other social benefits that justify this type of project. The sum of these two factors, social and economic, undoubtedly has a return or impact on society of considerable value that should never be ignored. If we have talked about the sector's capacity to integrate people at risk of exclusion, it is also a new source of employment thanks to the fact that until very recently it has been increasing the recruitment of specialized professionals in this sector, focusing on people's care activities and the management of social services. The report, Radiography of the Third Social Sector in Spain, Challenges and Opportunities in a Changing Environment, 2018 speaks of the need to anticipate the major changes that are to come, several of which are disruptive and will affect society as a whole and social economy organizations. The report also highlights that climate change will mean that social economy organizations dedicated to environmental issues will play a transcendental role. In addition, many of the transition movements will draw on working practices that we insist on describing as outdated, but which have maintained a better relationship with the natural environment and their local cultures. At European level, the involvement of social economy organizations in the labor market is similar. It is estimated that in 2009-2010 there were more than 14 million people working in the European social economy, including more than 9,200,000 in associations and other non-profit organizations. It is not only an important economic reality, accounting for 6.5% of paid employment in the European Union, but also a dynamic reality that has been growing steadily since the 1990s. It is also worth mentioning that the sector enjoys a certain quality of employment with more stability, more consideration for workers, and more dialogue with the people hired. Also, a lot of training and internships are offered, and the process is much more tailored to the needs of the individuals than in the private or public sector. However, when it comes to the contractual relationship with the administration and outsourced services, it is often a matter of annual calls and, therefore, temporary contracts that imply a certain degree of insecurity, making the sustainability of projects and indefinite contracts difficult. Actions are needed not only from the third sector and activism, but, above all, governmental actions and legislative changes for any meaningful transition from the conventional model of accelerated growth, also regarding the world of work. There are, currently, no policies designed to reduce consumption or production, or policies that include a universal basic income, job sharing, a reduced working week, etc. In fact, it is difficult to imagine how these policies could be implemented without legislation, but social economy entities could be a good vector for these changes, as they already share many characteristics with the doughnut economy. They combine economic, ecological, and social values, encourage citizens to participate in community life, tend to focus on solving the most urgent and local social problems, allow the creation of necessary jobs without the obsession for growth, and reinforce social, economic, and regional cohesion. Practical exercise. The doughnut economy can also be applicable when working on the concept of entrepreneurship with young people. For a certain type of enterprise organization, e.g. organic food producers or various local cooperatives, their link to the doughnut economy is clearer. However, there are ways for all business initiatives to engage with this framework. The women-led business group, The Big Whisper, has put together some questions that future young business leaders should ask themselves, in order to apply the spirit of doughnut to their projects. What core emotional and/or social need are we helping to meet through what we are offering? What are we doing to ensure that the way we produce and sell our goods and services does not harm the environment? What are we doing to make sure we give back to the ecosystem in which we participate? We can also ask ourselves whether we are covering the basic needs and reflect on the work and initiatives that are regenerative, both for citizens and the environment, and those that are extra, as we have been explaining throughout this chapter. We should ask young people not only about what, but also about how they see the organization of work within their initiatives. This can also provide an interesting debate and can serve as a starting point to introduce several of the ideas presented above. Accepting the doughnut economy requires work, effort, and changes. However, accepting our environmental responsibility is a small price to pay for an economy, a population, and a planet saved from an impending catastrophe.